Have you ever stood in a room full of people, your heart beating so loud that it drowned out the music, the chatter, the clinking glasses, and yet the person who swore to love you, honor you, and respect you until the end of time acted like you weren't even there? That was me, frozen in disbelief, as my husband laughed, twirled, and danced with her like the spotlight belonged only to them, as if I were nothing more than a forgotten shadow clinging to the edges of the night. It felt like betrayal disguised as charm, like humiliation dressed up as entertainment, and the ache inside me kept whispering that sometimes silence is louder than screaming. Before I take you through the whole storm that unraveled that night and the choices I made after, let me remind you, if you enjoy stories that feel raw, personal, and make you ask yourself, what would I do in her place? Then don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because here we tell the stories that sting and heal at the same time. Now, back to that moment. The ballroom was alive with golden chandeliers scattering fragments of light across polished floors, every table dressed in ivory linen, and every face painted with polite smiles, but my eyes kept locking on the way his hand lingered just a little too long on her waist, the way his laugh carried just a little too loudly when she leaned in close. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just an innocent dance. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe the unease inside me was a ghost of old insecurities. But deep down, I knew. I knew because I could feel the absence of his attention like a knife twisting where love was supposed to live. I could feel the invisible wall between us growing higher, brick by brick, with every spin she took in his arms. People around me might have seen a married man enjoying a dance at a celebration, but I saw a husband who had forgotten that his wife was watching. A man who forgot the woman he vowed to protect from loneliness was standing just steps away, drowning in it. The more I stood there, clutching the edge of my glass, the more the air seemed to suffocate me, not because of the perfume, the music, or the crowd, but because of the betrayal that seemed to drip off every move he made. I replayed years of sacrifice in my mind, every meal I cooked when I was exhausted, every time I chose to put his dreams above mine, every night I waited up while he worked late. And all I got in return was the humiliation of being treated like a piece of background furniture at our own event. And in that suffocating blur of laughter and applause, something inside me cracked, not loudly, not violently, but in a silent collapse that only I could feel. That's when I decided I wouldn't beg for attention, I wouldn't cause a scene, I wouldn't even let my tears betray me in front of strangers. No, I would vanish. Quietly. Completely. Without a single word. The kind of disappearance that speaks volumes without uttering a syllable. So I slipped away. Not in a dramatic rush or with a flurry of accusations, but with the kind of grace that comes when you're too numb to even feel the weight of your own footsteps. The crowd was too busy clapping for the dancers in the center of the room to notice me drift toward the exit. Each step felt like peeling off another layer of myself, like I was leaving behind a woman I had been for years. The loyal wife, the patient partner, the woman who smiled when she wanted to scream, until what remained was just a hollow echo of who I used to be. The cool night air hit me the moment I stepped outside, sharp against my skin, almost like the world was trying to remind me that I was still alive even though I felt dead inside. I stood under the glow of the streetlight, my breath fogging in the air, my heart still thundering with the music I had just left behind. I thought for a moment he would notice I was gone. That maybe after finishing the dance he'd glance around, searching for me with worry in his eyes, but the silence of my phone mocked me. No buzzing, no call, no message. That silence told me more about our marriage than any words ever could. I walked aimlessly at first, my heels clicking against the pavement, until the ache in my feet matched the ache in my chest. Every memory of our life together played like a cruel slideshow in my mind, our first date. The way he used to look at me like I was the only woman in the world, the promises whispered in the dark when we were too young to know how heavy those promises would become. And then, the more recent memories, the ones that hurt, the way he came home distracted, the excuses about late meetings, the coldness in his touch, the way he seemed more alive talking to strangers than he ever did with me. I realized then that the dance I had witnessed wasn't the beginning of the betrayal. It was the final act of a story that had been building for months, maybe even years. I walked into the night with no plan, no destination, just the raw determination to remove myself from the stage where I was treated like a prop. My phone buzzed once, and my heart leapt, but it wasn't him, it was a friend sending a casual text, something ordinary, almost absurdly out of place in that moment of unraveling. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My fingers shook as I shoved the phone back into my purse. Somewhere in the distance, laughter echoed from the venue, but it sounded like it belonged to another world, a world I no longer fit in. I caught my reflection in a darkened shop window as I passed, a woman in a glittering dress, makeup flawless, hair pinned perfectly, but eyes swollen with unshed tears. I barely recognized her. And that's when another decision crystallized inside me. If I could disappear from that party without anyone noticing, then maybe I could disappear from the entire life I had been living. Maybe the only way to be seen again was to vanish so completely that he'd finally realize what he had lost. But even as I thought it, a strange calm settled over me, because I wasn't vanishing to punish him, not really. I was vanishing for me. For the pieces of myself I had abandoned to keep our marriage alive, for the dreams I had put on hold, for the girl I used to be before I let his love define my worth. I walked farther, letting the city swallow me, one step at a time, into the unknown night. As the night stretched on and the city lights flickered like restless stars, I found myself wandering without any sense of time or direction. I wasn't just walking away from the ballroom, or from him, I was walking away from years of being invisible in plain sight, from the kind of marriage that looked perfect in photographs but felt empty in reality. My mind replayed the countless times I had silenced myself to keep peace, the times I swallowed my pride because he insisted his way was better, the evenings I sat alone at our dinner table staring at food that had gone cold because he was caught up at work again. They say love blinds you, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes love blinds you so well that you don't notice you've been fading out of someone's world until the night you realize you're already gone. I remembered how we met, how his smile had once lit me up like a sunrise, how his hand on mine had felt like safety, how I truly believed forever was written in our stars. But somewhere along the way, the light dimmed, the safety turned into routine, and forever began to look like a prison made of promises that only one of us kept. The more I thought, the clearer it became. He hadn't stolen my worth tonight by dancing with her. He had simply exposed the truth that I had been trying so hard to deny. He hadn't valued me in a long time. That realization cut deeper than any betrayal because it meant I had been betraying myself, too, by staying, by hoping, by believing I was still the woman in his heart when in reality I was just an accessory in his life. I ended up at a quiet park, where the hum of the city softened into whispers and the cool grass still held the dampness of evening dew. I sat on a bench beneath a flickering lamppost, my dress bunching awkwardly, my heels finally kicked off beside me. For the first time in years, I let myself cry without fear of being judged, without worrying if my mascara would smear, without caring that the world might see me broken. The tears felt cleansing, like each one was washing away a layer of lies I had been telling myself, that things would get better, that love was enough, that I wasn't allowed to want more. Sitting there, with mascara running and hair unraveling, I felt more honest than I had in a long time. I thought of the girl I used to be before marriage, the girl who had dreams of traveling, of writing, of living boldly, not just existing quietly. She had gotten lost somewhere between his needs, his career, his plans, and the version of me that was left had been shrinking a little more every day. That's when the thought returned, stronger and sharper. I needed to vanish, not just from that ballroom but from the whole version of life that had been suffocating me. I pulled out my phone again, staring at the screen that remained stubbornly free of his name. No missed calls, no frantic messages asking where I was, no evidence that my absence had even registered. I scrolled through our old photos instead, smiles that now looked rehearsed, vacations where I remembered feeling lonelier than I admitted, dinners where his eyes were more on his phone than on me. I wondered how long I had been convincing myself that a ghost of love was enough to keep me tethered. And there, in the glow of that screen, I quietly deleted our photos one by one. It was almost ceremonial, like shedding skins I no longer needed, like lifting weights I had carried for too long. Each deletion felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like, or where I would sleep that night, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was making a choice for me. The night deepened, and the park emptied until I was alone with only the hum of distant traffic and the chirping of unseen crickets. My feet were sore, my body exhausted, but my mind was more awake than ever. I thought about how people always talk about betrayal like it's a sudden explosion, but sometimes betrayal is slow erosion, little choices, and little neglects that pile up until the foundation crumbles. Tonight was just the collapse I could no longer ignore. And as the lamplight buzzed overhead, I whispered to myself words I had never dared to say out loud: I deserve more. They sounded strange, almost foreign, but they felt right, like the beginning of a sentence I was finally ready to finish. By the time the first faint light of dawn began stretching across the sky, I was still on that park bench, barefoot and exhausted, but strangely unwilling to go back to the house that had felt more like a museum than a home for months. The thought of walking through that door, smelling the faint traces of his cologne in the hallway, seeing the bed we shared but hadn't really shared in spirit for a long time, it made my stomach turn. I realized that if I went back, if I allowed myself to slip into the routine again, then all the courage I felt in that moment would disappear, swallowed up by the endless cycle of apologies that never came and promises that never meant anything. So instead of going back, I started thinking about what it would take to really vanish, to walk away not just physically but emotionally, to reclaim the life I had given up piece by piece until I was almost unrecognizable to myself. It wasn't anger driving me anymore. It was clarity, and clarity can be the most powerful force in the world. I thought about the money I had quietly saved from my freelance work, the documents tucked in a folder that I had ignored for years, the contacts I hadn't reached out to because I was always too busy being his wife. Suddenly, all of it felt like the bricks of a path leading somewhere new. I took out my phone again, scrolling through my messages, not for him, but for the people I hadn't spoken to in so long. There was my college friend Sarah, who had once told me I could crash on her couch anytime I needed. There was my aunt, who always asked when I would visit, even though I always said I couldn't because life was too complicated. I thought about calling them right then, but something inside me said I wasn't ready yet. Not until I had taken the first step alone, to prove to myself that I could. So instead, I booked a cheap hotel room on the far side of the city with the emergency card I had kept hidden for years, the one I told myself I would never need. The confirmation email pinged into my inbox, and it felt like both a knife and a key, cutting through the old version of me while unlocking the new. The walk to the hotel was long, my dress dragging at the hem, my hair a tangled mess, but every step felt lighter than the one before. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't worried about whether he would approve, whether he would notice, whether anyone else would understand. This was my choice, my escape, my quiet rebellion against years of being silenced by the weight of expectations. When I finally reached the small lobby of the hotel, the receptionist barely glanced at me, and I was grateful for it. No questions, no pity, just a key card slid across the counter. I held onto it like it was a passport to freedom. Inside the room, the silence was deafening, but in a good way. No ticking of his watch on the nightstand, no faint buzz of his phone lighting up with messages he never explained, no reminders of all the ways I had shrunk myself to fit into his life. Just silence, pure and raw, and for once it felt like it belonged to me. I collapsed onto the bed, still in my wrinkled gown, staring at the ceiling as if it held all the answers I'd been too afraid to ask. Sleep came in fragments, broken by waves of realization that I was really doing it, I was really vanishing without a word. When I woke hours later, the sunlight cut through the curtains, and I felt both terrified and liberated. My phone still had no messages from him. Not even a, "Where are you?" Not even a, "Are you okay?" That silence stung, but it also validated everything I already knew. He had stopped seeing me long before I chose to disappear. I spent that day in the hotel room, writing in a notebook I found in my bag. I wrote letters I knew I'd never send, letters to him, to myself, to the girl I used to be. In one, I wrote about the night he first told me he loved me, how my heart had nearly exploded with joy, how I had believed it was the start of something eternal. In another, I wrote about the slow death of our connection, the countless little moments where I should have noticed the cracks. I wrote about how love isn't supposed to make you feel invisible, how being someone's wife shouldn't mean erasing yourself to fit into the background of his story. Each word I scribbled was like a thread unraveling from the rope that had tied me down. And as I filled those pages, I realized I wasn't just vanishing from him, I was reappearing for me. That evening, I ordered takeout, something simple, and sat by the window eating alone while watching strangers walk by on the street below. I noticed how alive they all seemed, how free, how ordinary, and it made me realize how extraordinary my decision was. I wasn't running because I was weak, I was leaving because I was strong enough to admit that staying was killing me. Strength doesn't always roar, it sometimes looks like a woman quietly packing up her heart and choosing to start over. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether he would finally notice, whether he would try to find me, whether I would even let him if he did. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. The unknown felt safer than the certainty of being unloved. The next morning, sunlight streamed across the small hotel room like a quiet invitation, and for a long while I simply lay there, breathing, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat, realizing that I hadn't heard it this clearly in years. No interruptions, no footsteps outside the bedroom, no forced small talk over coffee that always left me emptier than silence, just me, existing on my own terms. I picked up my phone, almost mechanically, half expecting to see his name flashing at last, but there was still nothing. The screen stared back at me with the kind of cold indifference that mirrored his absence. That was the moment it hit me fully. My disappearance wasn't noticed because in his world, I had already been gone long before I physically left. I wasn't a character in his story anymore. I had been reduced to background noise, a shadow he assumed would always linger no matter how far he pushed me. And if I hadn't vanished last night, I would have continued living that way, erasing myself until nothing remained. Strangely, instead of bitterness, I felt peace. It was as though my vanishing wasn't an act of revenge but a declaration of self-worth, a way of telling the universe that I refused to be treated as invisible any longer. I spent that day walking the city with new eyes. The same streets that once felt crowded and overwhelming now seemed full of possibility. I noticed the sound of children laughing near a fountain, the warmth of a coffee shop I'd passed 1,000 times but never entered, the way people hurried across intersections chasing their own lives. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing anyone else's shadow, I was simply present. I ducked into a small bookstore, letting my fingers trail across the spines of novels I once loved but had stopped reading because he didn't like fiction. I bought one without hesitation, tucking it under my arm like a treasure. Later, I sat in that same park where I had cried through the night, but this time I opened the book and read beneath the trees, feeling alive in a way that was both fragile and fierce. And as I turned each page, I thought of the woman I was becoming, the woman who could walk away from a gilded cage and find beauty in her own solitude. By evening, curiosity tugged at me. I finally opened social media, half expecting to see some kind of post from him, maybe a worried update, maybe anger at my vanishing, but instead I saw pictures of him smiling, surrounded by friends, glass in hand, as though the night had never been interrupted. The girl he danced with was in the background of one shot, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. My stomach twisted, but then something surprising happened. I laughed. A soft, tired laugh, but real. Because suddenly, I saw the truth with unflinching clarity. My vanishing hadn't left a hole in his life, but it had filled one in mine. I wasn't gone, I had simply shifted from being invisible in his story to being visible in my own. That laugh turned into a smile, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel forced. The days that followed were not easy. Freedom never is. There were moments when loneliness threatened to creep in, when I almost reached for my phone to call him, when I missed the comfort of routine even if that routine had been hollow. But every time doubt whispered in my ear, I reminded myself of that dance, the way his hand had held hers while mine hung useless at my side, the way his laughter filled the room while my silence filled my chest. That memory became my anchor, not of pain, but of power. It reminded me why I had walked away, why I couldn't go back, why vanishing had been the bravest choice I'd ever made. And each time I held on to that truth, the loneliness faded, replaced by a growing sense of strength. Weeks later, when he finally did call, his name lighting up my screen like a ghost from another life, I stared at it for a long moment. My hands trembled, not from longing, but from the realization that I didn't owe him anything. I didn't owe him explanations, I didn't owe him closure, I didn't even owe him my voice. So I let it ring, over and over, until it stopped. And when it did, I set the phone down, took a deep breath, and smiled again. Because I knew in that moment that I had reclaimed myself. He may never understand the silence I left behind, but that wasn't my burden anymore. My silence was no longer about him, it was about me, about the woman who chose to vanish not out of weakness but out of strength, who chose to leave behind the version of herself that had been treated like nothing and step into a life where she was everything. So yes, my husband danced with her like I was nothing, but instead of breaking me, it woke me. And the vanishing act I performed that night wasn't an ending, but a beginning. A quiet, powerful, wordless beginning that I will never regret. And if you've ever felt invisible in someone else's story, maybe my choice will remind you that sometimes disappearing is the only way to finally be seen. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe, because more stories like this deserve to be told, not just mine, but yours too.